Okay, well, I think we'll make a start, and some others may join. It's a warm afternoon, so a couple of people contacted me earlier saying that it's probably a little too hot to be in front of yet another screen, so they're going to catch up on the recording anyway. This will be shared widely as a recording. So hello to all the people in live, and hello to all the people who catch this a little bit later. So welcome to this DRIVA Arts DRIVA session. It's our second online roundtable. This one we're looking at the topic of renewal through data. Data is the common denominator through all the DRIVA Arts DRIVA sessions, big data, small data, and the way that people use it and the value it creates. And whilst we aren't going to keep dwelling too much on this strange and crazy time and make this all about the pandemic, it's a backdrop for us to talk about renewal, recovery, resetting, how businesses and entrepreneurs particularly are thinking about what comes next and the role that data might play. For those that are joining, this being your first DRIVA Arts DRIVA engagement, delighted to have you on board in the programme. DRIVA Arts DRIVA is a University of Brighton led project, multidisciplinary project spanning all sorts of exciting collaborative opportunities, sparking superfusion of creativity between business and creative organisations. It's a wide research project using Gatwick Airport's proprietary data as a stimulus. So looking at the sort of value that a big data set from an airport might offer, but very much using that to spark and create all sorts of other conversations and projects and ideas all around innovation, place, transport, and the role of data more broadly. You can find out a lot more about the project and find resources from past events and have access to the team. So Jen, who was talking just then about haircuts, is one of the DRIVA Arts DRIVA team, and her and her colleague Stuart offer lots of brilliant one-to-one support for any small business and enterprise or creative that wants to use the resources that are available through the project. So do make sure you visit the site and have a explore. So the way today is going to work is that we have 3 lightning talks, lightning speakers, I call them, people who are going to give a very sort of truncated whistle-stop tour of some of the work they've been doing, some of the projects and ideas that they've been a part of, and I'm really excited about the 3 guests that we have today. And they're going to kind of throw a little bit of a virtual hand grenade, a provocation perhaps, some ideas and thoughts that we can then pick up in an open conversation for anybody then who's on online.
Have we got you back, Rich?
Sorry, everybody. I've just had a power cut, which completely knocked out. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Vicky, for jumping in there. As I was just saying, housekeeping. I'm going to keep people muted to avoid background noise. Hopefully, I'll remain with you now. That feels like a good point then for me to pass over to our first lightning talk, and I'll be quiet, and hopefully this will resolve itself. So I'm going to hand over to Lowena. Lowena is an extraordinary young computer programmer, scientist, award winner. She's going to tell you a lot about the project that she got to pitch to the UK Space Agency. I'm forever inspired by this lady, but she'll tell you a little bit more about herself and her work. Over to you, Lowena.
I'm assuming you can all hear me. That's quite a glowing introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the proposal I submitted for a competition which was run by the UK Space Agency. It's called the Satellite competition, and you submit a proposal on how you can use satellite data to solve any issue you see. So it might be a local issue, it might be a nationwide, it might even be an international issue. So my proposal was using satellite data specifically GPS, to track abandoned shopping trolleys. So this is quicker collection, so less of a damage, which means there's less of a financial loss. So it's a financial and an environmental issue. And my proposal mainly centered on that issue, using that GPS data. It uses a principle of geofencing. So this is simply saying if the GPS coordinates, the latitude and longitude, if they're outside some certain limits, then we want to kind of start to think about collecting that. And there's a lot of data that comes along with this. So there's data about what routes people take through the car park. And obviously it's looking at how can this data be used? Can I see how I can better design my car parks, my parking bays? Can I see where and when trolleys are most commonly abandoned? And I can use this to target my collection. So you're not sending people out blindly trying to find these. You know where they're likely to be and when you want to go pick them up. So there's data on that side. I also thought it would be interesting to look at data for trolley routes inside the store. So this uses IPS, indoor positioning system. It can be Bluetooth, wireless, RFID. So this is all about looking about what routes trolleys take through the supermarket. And this can be useful to test the effectiveness of marketing. So for example, if before a marketing campaign, 20% of people stopped and looked at something. And then after your campaign or during, 80% of people looked. You can use this to kind of see, is my campaign effective? And you compare this with sales data. So if your sales are going up, if you've got double, triple the number of sales, you can say, this is an effective marketing campaign. And I think it's important to realize how we can use this data paired with a couple of psychological tricks. So I've got a couple. It's called the Boomerang Effect. It's if there's something that you want which is near the start of an aisle, shoppers tend to just take it and then leave the aisle. They don't go all the way down. So supermarkets realize that, and they decided to start putting popular brands in the middle of aisles. So you have to go all the way in and you'll continue through. And when you do that, you're more likely to buy things. There's more impulse buying, which is better for the stores. And it's psychological tricks like this, which can be discovered through data. So if you say, oh, a lot of people like to stop, we've seen this from our trolley data, that a lot of people like to take a stop around aisle 3. How about we put items we really want to sell at the end of aisle 3? And so it's using this to boost sales. And it's sort of like cookies can see what you've been looking at online. These supermarket trolleys can see what people are looking at in store. So there's definitely a commercial potential. And I think it's very important to change our perspective of supermarket trolleys, not just from item holders, but to data collectors. And then we can really start to see, how can we commercialize this data? What can we do with it? So that's a quick overview on my project, which was looking at data and shopping and supermarket trolleys.
Thanks, Lorena. That's a perfect example of the sort of thing that we're talking about, and that's a project that you've been working on from the kind of second part of last year. Is that right? And you got to pitch it as an idea. What I'll come back to you a little bit later is on what role that project might have, or what other questions that project might be raising now that people's shopping habits have almost sort of been thrown up in a tumble dryer and then spun dry again. Supermarkets suddenly having a very different role in society in the last few months than we'd ever imagined. So they might be thinking differently about how to configure their spaces as well for all sorts of reasons. So I'm going to come back to you on that, but that's a great example. Thank you very much, Lorena, for that little insight into a data-led renewal idea. I'm going to hand over now to Ben. I'm going to bring Ben in. Ben's a product and design leader, formerly at Babylon Health and Clear Left. Worked with lots and lots of big brands around product design and product development. But the main thing that Ben's going to be talking about, and how I was delighted to be put in touch with Ben a few weeks ago, is around the 3D Crowd project, which I think has been one of the most remarkable and impressive, rapid, collaborative programs that I've ever seen. I'll leave Ben to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But Ben, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to compress a very varied and dramatic journey into 5 minutes for you. But essentially, 3D Crowd is the largest voluntary effort in the world to 3D print face shields for health workers and people on the front line. It was really inspired by Joseph Prussia, who is probably the sort of Steve Jobs of 3D printers, if you want a sort of simple shortcut to who he is. And he released a design for face shields on his website in March or February. I can't remember exactly when it was. Anyway, so lots of groups spun up over the world trying to print his design. So I joined one and very quickly was allocated the role of leader. We grew to 8,000 volunteers in 2 weeks in late March. We were getting tens of thousands of pounds in a GoFundMe account right away, national press. Eventually, we hit 1.5 million orders, and those orders came from frontline workers like solo nurse to heads of trust, asking for 100,000 units. Now, obviously, 3D printing is very responsive at a local level, but is very slow at sort of mass production. So we never really got near the numbers that would provide 1.5 million units. But we did, to date, ship 200,000 in a kind of local network. And to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the drama and some of the challenges that happened in the early weeks. But let me just say that there's an enormous number of heroes in this story. We even had somebody fly a box to Northern Ireland in a Cessna because we were trying to hit all of the hospitals that were designated hotspots. And we were having trouble routing these boxes of face shields around the country. So somebody very kindly decided to fly over. Anyway, what were those first few weeks like? Well, I think what you have to understand that it was extremely reactive, right? There was no grand plan. We were all just getting hit with very difficult challenges to face right now. Sorry, someone's coming to the room. Imagine that you have lots and lots of people screaming at you for the product and lots of people screaming at you for guidance as to how to make them. Funding as well. We were trying to route some of the funding and the supplies that we were using out to the people with their 3D printers. So it became a very reactive job, and there wasn't a whole lot of planning. I think the main jobs were, as I mentioned, enabling the makers, managing the supply and the demand. Really, the role of the central organization was to connect the supply and demand, figure out the distribution model, because parts of it were centralized and parts of it were hyper-local. We ended up actually mainly supporting the local model and leaving the big trusts and the hospitals to catch up with supply from much larger manufacturers like Nissan got involved to ship hundreds of thousands from their factories. Fundraising, logistics, just getting like a big truck of transparent plastic from, Sunderland to Sheffield or whatever it was, so that we could actually do very agile and responsive distribution. It started running off of Google Sheets and Google Forms, and then we very quickly put something called AppSheet over the top of it to try and manage the list of volunteers, manage the demand. But it was an enormous hack. It was lots of people wanted much more functionality, of course, because lots of people with 3D printers are in tech. They think they can do better with it. It fell over a lot. People couldn't log in and they couldn't figure out where their orders were supposed to go to. But we had a philosophy of not agonizing over our choices. And I want to explain why that was. And actually, it was why the group was more successful in the long run than many of the other groups that tried to attempt the same things. In the final weeks of March, or sometime around that time, I watched a talk by the chief executive of the WHO, Dr. Michael J. Ryan. And he was talking about the Ebola crisis and what the Ebola crisis teaches you around how you make decisions in response to a pandemic. And he basically said, the greatest error is not to move. There's no perfection. You cannot agonize over your choices. You will make wrong ones, but the virus leads the pace. So you have to respond extremely quickly. And if you're wrong, you course correct, but do not agonize over decisions. And for that reason, we were very agile about our choice of design, like which product we chose the 8,000 makers to make, about the way we did funding and distribution. There were mistakes, but we kind of stuck to our guns and stuck to our decisions a lot of the time and didn't agonize. We made a decision and then we stuck with it. We didn't agonize too much. Lots of the other groups that were doing the same thing as us actually took too long to think about legal and approval and missed their window to get the makers off the ground and running and producing so that we could save lives with the gear. And it's really stuck with me how effectively the pandemic has forced bureaucratic decision-making change. And I encountered a lot of people who were still operating in the mode of peacetime, when actually what I recognized very quickly was that we're in, you know, the closest analogy is wartime, right? The way you make decisions, the way you act has to be very different. The rules, the logistics, the safety measures, the things that you would normally take time over that are very useful in peacetime don't apply anymore. And in fact, this is, even historians reckon this is the reason lots of civilizations have failed historically, because when the environment changes, they cannot simplify their decision-making and structures quickly enough. So I was very, very conscious of that. I'll just round up by saying that I saw the absolute best and the absolute worst in people. So we had this army of volunteers all over the country ready to drop everything and just do whatever it took, to drive all over the country, to borrow their mate's truck, to just do anything, fly a plane, anything and everything. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of opportunism, because when you have that many volunteers join an effort very quickly, it's not like a professional context where you can weed people out. There were lots of very, very unmanageable behaviors that actually slowed us down and took us by surprise. But I'm grateful to come out the other side realizing that when emergencies happen, it isn't like The Walking Dead suggests. There's a lot of apocalyptic fiction that would suggest that we behave terribly in an emergency, and I can absolutely attest to the fact that aside from our government and its atrocious response, which I did have first-hand experience of, and I won't go into too much depth, but just let me tell you, it was as incompetent, as slow and ridiculous as you might think. And just to say that I have renewed faith in people as a result of this thing. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. What an extraordinary tale and effort. Yeah, unparalleled, I think. Fascinating about your observation around decision making, and that what do you do with information, and the information coming at speed from all sorts of different directions, and information that needs action or actioning turning into something else, an insight being turned into a kind of an outcome, and the inadequacy of a lot of the sort of the ready-made tools there are for that, I think is really fascinating, and something I'd like to pick up on again in our open discussion later. Brilliant, thank you very much, Ben. So certainly not leastly, but lastly of our lightning talks, I'm going to throw over to Adam Sheldon, director of Big Egg Films. I've known Adam for a very long time, and always impressed with Adam's agility to adapt and create and innovate and move interesting projects into different directions very quickly. And I think the one that you're going to talk about is no different. Now I know that the kind of technology that you've been using amongst many other innovative ideas on how to remotely film people, obviously as a filmmaker who makes promotional videos for companies, taking away the ability of you to actually go and film anyone is a pretty fundamental barrier, and you'll talk a little bit about how you've been overcoming that. But I think, but what's very interesting is the technology that you've been looking at as something new for businesses in their next phase to be thinking about, and how data drives their filmmaking decisions. So, Adam, over to you.
Thank you. How do you follow those two? That's amazing stories. So I'm Adam from Big Egg Films. We predominantly work, we do broadcast for TV, but mostly web videos, web content. And we work with corporate companies, we work with universities, but our sort of favoured area is charities and CICs, and generally people that are doing good stuff, really, in the world. We're currently helping a charity in Zambia at the moment with their COVID campaign, and a few other things, bits and pieces. But we've always been really interested in finding ways to prove that our stuff is actually useful, because, you know, actual evidence to prove the outcomes of our video campaigns are working and what a successful campaign looked like. You know, other than video clicks, which we've always had, and basic traffic monitoring, the impact has been largely anecdotal, being able to pin down exactly how something has helped. So the global pandemic has given us a kick up the bum, basically, to get this covered and get this sorted out. We started looking at data and how we could use this to just best track impact. I'm no scientist, I'm a filmmaker, but you know, kind of technology really has to work for me, and it takes me a long time for it to sink in. So if I understood it, my logic was then I could explain it to other people. So I'm not as quick, I'm definitely not a digital native by any stretch of the imagination. So it's very timely as well, us having to look into this data, because obviously everyone's money, especially charity money, is so much more, needs to work for them now in these crazy times. And we don't want to be we reduced our prices initially, but we don't want to kind of be taking stuff off if we can't prove it works. So what we did was we started looking at third-party plugins, and we just found so many solutions. We're working with one company at the moment, and these are the sorts of things they help us do. And I just didn't know this was out there. Turns out I don't have to be an expert on this. Their work and how they help us is focusing on customization. So they help us with active call to action buttons, and they let us, they're able to orchestrate the journey. So if someone watches one video, where do they go next? And how can we change that to meet that person's needs? Really useful with a charity, because you can plan where you want them to go next. We also, they offered A/B testing, which I know is probably everyone's like, oh yeah, we're so over this. But for us, that was like, okay, I feel a little bit like my mum with this technology, but being able to kind of check which thumbnail generates the same video, two videos exactly the same, but just a different thumbnail at the start, and just being able to monitor that. And the rates of engagement was like up by 30% when we changed the picture slightly. Drop-off rates, you know, traditionally we'd put a video out there, cross our fingers, obviously do all the pre-production, but cross our fingers and hope that it just does what we want it to do. But then we found with this data, we're able to make changes quickly and adjust and see a bigger kind of engagement rate because of that. So it's a bit more nimble. And I mean, the key thing is the transparency that it offers us. So for charities, we can show, and for companies as well, when they want to talk about return on investment and things like that, you know, we can actually say, look, you know, this is reached here. It links up with HubSpot, it plugs into that, and so they can see as well. So it's a real game changer for us, and all this data obviously governs what they then put their money into next time, and where their audience's appetite is, and how best to sort of structure the video and what call to action. And this obviously, at first I felt a little bit icky about, is this snooping? What is this? But you know, the data's always been collected. It's always, you know, it's just never been in my opinion, in the hands of the people making those decisions. So this just makes it so much more accessible. And this stuff is a wormhole. Like I said, I'm not an expert. So half the battle is working out what's useful to each individual client in this challenging time that we find ourselves in. But yeah, having a relationship with this third-party plugin has just been a real game changer. This doesn't feel like a kind of exploration in the level of a scientific way that the others have talked about. But I do, you know, genuinely, I suppose in a way it's testament that someone like me can learn this, and it has actually physically helped, and we can see engagement. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that was useful.
Really useful. Thank you, Adam. Fantastic. And I think adds a really interesting angle there as well. You know, it's about measuring that value for money, making those decisions with in times of finite resources, knowing how to get from A to B in the quickest, most effective way and to have the biggest impact is absolutely vital. And data and insight can show us that. But as you say, there are many, many people, and that's what we're talking about here, who don't feel equipped or have the tools necessarily to do it. So that's absolutely vital. So great, thank you, the three of you. So we've heard three different stories there, all related to the way information and data is collected and used to create different sorts of insight. And I guess the thing that's common to all three of those more than anything is around decision making. How do we turn that information into something that people can then use to make better judgments than if they didn't have it? Whether you are a supermarket thinking about how to sell certain products, or a mass volunteer network thinking about how to get life-saving equipment to people in the right place and in the right way, or about the impact that a media campaign can have. So we're going to open up the conversation now. I'm going to bring back my screen, which will have some questions on in a second. The questions, oh, we've done the poll, that's good. The questions that I want to look at first is particularly thinking about business behaviour. So I invite all the people that haven't spoken that are on the line that want to contribute, please do. You can use the chat bar to ask a question. If you don't want to speak out loud, I can ask on your behalf, or by all means just unmute yourself and join in. But the questions that I really want to focus on are looking at business behaviour. So are businesses now paying more attention to the data they collect? So it's a general question. Do we think that businesses of all kinds are becoming more conscious, are developing more kind of skills within their teams to think about the data they collect? Obviously, the kind of GDPR rules coming in a few years ago got people thinking about data in ways that they hadn't before, but that seemed to be all about privacy and being careful with other people's data. I want to think about what businesses might now be doing. Is there a bit of a revolution in businesses thinking about the data that they collect as a function of their business and a tool? What sectors particularly have we come across that are using data as part of their recovery? We know that it's not a level playing field for different sectors at the moment. You know, if you are a supermarket, you've probably done all right. If you are a B&B, not so much. So I want to think about how different sectors might be using data, and maybe which ones should be using it. Are there different ways, are there new ways that people could be using data to lead their recovery and the decisions they make? I'm interested to hear from people here today on any thoughts around that. And then also kind of smarter use of insights that might transform different sectors as well. Any anecdotes or stories around innovations that people are aware of that different sectors are starting to look into? There certainly are out there, and we'll draw on some of those. So that's what I'm going to throw there as the first set of questions I want you to ruminate on. I'm going to go back to Loena first, as I said I would, thinking about your experience working with the Trolley project. Do you think that, from your knowledge of supermarkets, that the implications of the data that you're collecting might influence or be a part of the way that supermarkets are thinking differently about how people use their spaces?
Yes, it's a good question. So going back on, in particular, indoor tracking, I think this data will be used in ways, or it has the potential to be used in ways to influence layouts of stores so that you're minimizing contact between different people in the store. So it has the potential to be something, a great asset, really useful. And that's just one that I've thought of now, but there's probably a dozen other ways in which this data can be used to really help supermarkets bounce back stronger. They haven't obviously been hit as much as sectors such as like the hospitality sector, but I think this data is something that can really be implemented to their advantage.
And you know, as we know, all kind of retailers and indoor spaces, retail spaces, commercial spaces are kind of opening now. Some did last week, and some will be in early July. Now, not everyone's going to have trolleys, and not everyone's going to have kind of mobile data collectors in that way. But are there other ways, do you think, that you know, businesses that have to carefully manage their spaces and think about the movement of people, and in order to reassure and give comfort to people that, you know, that they are going to be able to move around safely? Do you think there are ways in which those businesses can publish or use or collect or think about data in a different way?
So obviously I've based mine on a trolley, but something like an RFID tag is relatively small. You can get them quite small, and they serve their purpose even when they're quite small. And those can be attached to things like baskets, which are quite small, and you'll often find them in say, clothing stores, and you'll find them in a lot of shops. And so these are items which I think shops can utilize pretty well for not a huge financial cost. And that would be a really useful way of collecting data about how do people go around the store. Are there certain parts of the store where people tend to accumulate, and they're not really keeping to that 1 meter, 2 meter separation? How can we change that layout to accommodate this and to make people a bit more spread out? So there are several ways in which this data can be collected. So RFID tags being just one, but certain stores would have to tailor how they collect that data to the experience.
And yeah, and I think it's, you know, we're now looking to those businesses, aren't we, we need reassurance from them that they're all over this, that they know how people move around their space, that they know where the bottlenecks are, that they're going to, so that when we go in there, they've thought about that. And that's a kind of trust, an implicit trust that we put in. So it'd be interesting to see those that feel more confident in displaying that versus those that really don't know how to do that. I'm going to put in Rachel. Rachel, you're not going to get away with not speaking. You've raised a really interesting point on the chat box there. You don't think that companies are paying more attention because of a sort of lack of trust with the COVID tracking app being seen as a risk for personal data sharing. Can you expand a little bit on your thought?
Yeah, that was just an example. I just feel like there's been a lot of talk about big data, particularly for quite a long time, but I don't know if there's been any progress with that. You know, maybe it's just that I'm not aware of what, you know, the bigger companies that were already starting to use some data are doing. But it just feels like we haven't moved forward very much because of the trust issue, that people are perhaps missing opportunities to gather data because they're afraid to ask. But also those individuals and businesses are wary of passing over any more data than they have to. You know, in free trials and things like that, people are worried, aren't they, about getting stuck into something that they weren't prepared for.
And I guess perhaps that's something, or that's quite telling about the attitude towards data in different sizes of business. Probably small businesses view data as personal details of customers so that we can inform them about things or get their attention or understand what they like or don't like about our products. It's all about kind of market research and about visibility of product. Whereas what the bigger businesses, like Lowena's example, is using it doesn't care, you know, those trolleys don't care about the name of the individual that's using it or what their demographic is. It's about purely that's looking at behaviour and it's aggregating that data to try and make some decisions about the sorts of things, the ways the customers move. And I wonder if this is an opportunity now for the smaller businesses that are thinking about their new shape and the way that they come out of this to think more about that kind of aggregated sensory data that picks up on how people interact with them, not necessarily just thinking about the mailing list. I don't have an answer there. It's a kind of a follow on to your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think perhaps just the smaller businesses, you know, like myself, just need some more education and clarity on what can be done, you know, through things like this, where you can see some amazing examples. But yeah, just to learn actually what can be done.
And people, if obviously you haven't had a formal introduction or space to introduce yourself, do say where you're from and your business or organisation. Rachel, you can let people know where you're from.
Do you want me to stay in the chat or here?
You can say it.
Okay, so my company is Shake It Up Creative. We're a marketing agency based in Worthing, and we do SEO, build websites, PR campaigns, and design and marketing. So all the creative stuff, generally working with SMEs in Sussex, a couple further afield. But, yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else with questions or points, please do just chip in and shut me up, or maybe just put a little note in the chat bar, and I'll bring you in to talk. Ben, I'm going to come back to you if that's okay. Thinking about the what is the value now of the information and the data that your project has been collecting? So you're going to have a bit of a lake of information about the needs of frontline healthcare workers, about who is producing, who is part of this kind of micro manufacturing network, what the capacity of that is, how quickly things can get from one place to another or not. That's hugely valuable, isn't it? What's going to happen with that data?
Well, as the urgency of the crisis has calmed down, there have been lots of discussions about what the 3D Crowd organization does. I'm not involved day to day anymore, but you can imagine that once you've set up what might be the largest print farm, on-demand distributed manufacturing print farm in the world, you know, that has a lot of future potential in terms of being able to commission, you know, local manufacturing to meet particular needs. We haven't found cases where that might be the case, but I would say in relation to the future of the org, it's really up to the members, right? The volunteers have to decide whether they'd like to be part of something that gives that network, that group, that supply and demand map a future, because it has to be democratic. With regards to the data about demand, you know, we felt at various points that we probably had the best sense of where PPE was needed in the country. I mean, we don't know what else, but the fact that all these health workers all over the country had heard about our forms and our organization and just started putting their names in, and clearly something was falling over in terms of the communication and the procurement of the gear around the country. I suppose it's sort of a lesson in how it's a lesson in necessity, how you can gather data and make some very urgent decisions with it very quickly in difficult circumstances. And the tools that we have today to gather data and do something with it, whilst they frustrate me day to day, are actually have hit a point of maturity that means that a volunteer group can do things like this now, whereas that would have been very difficult in previous years. You know, it's not that long ago that if you wanted large databases, you had to go and buy a box from Oracle, or you had to do very, very slow, manual, difficult things. Now, the dark side of that is the ethical stuff that we've touched on, right? The fact that data gathering is so easy. You know, Kevin Kelly at Wired called the internet a big surveillance machine. So the dark side of it is that actually I would argue most, and this is not my argument, I'm repeating somebody else's, most data that businesses collect, or organizations rather, is actually toxic waste. It's not something you're ever going to use. It's not ever going to give you insight. You just gather it because you think it's going to be necessary one day. Where if you actually ask the question, what data and information is actually necessary for me to make decisions and serve humanity better, you probably only need a tiny bit of that, or certain slices, and you should probably be throwing away the rest, as GDPR now suggests. And what I see a lot of in the organizations I've worked with is gather as much as you can and still not really figure out what your most important questions are. And I would argue it needs to be the other way around. What are your most important questions? Then figure out what data you need, then go collect it. Yeah.
Really interesting. Adam, you talked a lot about working with charity sector, and I think the charity sector has been no stranger to measurement. It's pulled in all sorts of different directions to justify existence and to quantify impact and reach and so on. But and that's where, perhaps has been your starting point in terms of your kind of use of video. But do you think that this is, in terms of understanding engagement with media platforms and looking at how people sort of consume information, that's a slightly different kind of thing that's being measured, isn't it? It's not just about outputs and outcomes. We did this and so that person's better, or we did this and that person's now, off the streets or whatever. It's slightly more nuanced. What do you see as the impact of people really understanding how people engage with the kind of content that they put out there? What implications are there for a number of different sectors, do you think?
Well, firstly, yes, charity sector is probably, has been doing this for years and years and years. But what we find is we work with a lot of charities that are really small and just starting out and don't have access to that data. So, I mean, for me, it feels like there is definitely a shift, and the power is being put into their hands because of these brilliant third-party apps that measure this stuff. So, and that's a practical thing and SMEs all over. There's so much that can be learnt from this. I mean, traditionally, the viral video, there's car companies that essentially are advert farms. So they come up with a concept and then they shoot at the same time 100 different versions of this at great expense, and then measure everything, and then they piece back together the best sections which got the most engagement. And so it's almost like a crowdsourced narrative that was the most popular. And that's been going on for years and years. So I just feel like it's a shift in power. And I think for the smaller companies that often get forgotten about or maybe don't have a place at the table, there is the potential to really explore that, and it's making it more accessible. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah. Definitely in terms of scale, that's the impact, because the big guys have always been able to do that or always at the cutting edge of that. But being able to actually have access to, and it's affordable. It's really, really affordable now. So yeah, certainly in my sector.
Thank you. Ushi, Thomas, Jen, Elizabeth, Rachel, again, you're all very welcome to ask questions of our guests, or just to put in an example or a thought, please do so. Ushi, you've popped up. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, sorry, I've had the video off. I'm kind of moving around quite a lot and I didn't want to be distracted.
It's a hot afternoon.
Yeah, it's not just that I need to move around. Down for too long. I was wondering about, so some of the businesses and sectors that are getting left behind from the lockdown easing, like theatres, for instance, how they can better use data. And I'm aware there's a lot of surveys around about impact of COVID on creative industries. So that's a certain type of data, and it seems to be about kind of consumer confidence, venues, spaces, that kind of thing. So that's a certain type and amount of data, but I'm wondering, yeah, how those sectors could use data a lot more. Like, what is the science that's not allowing theatres to open when cinemas can? Or do you know what I mean? Is there a way that data can be used to lobby? I know that's an upcoming event as well.
We're into next week's discussion, but I think that's a very interesting question. I think the debate around ownership of data has been a really interesting one in the last few months. You know,
there's so much open source now, isn't there?
Absolutely, and you hear the sage scientists saying we are publishing it, you know, but please understand, a lot of it's still guesswork. You know, there's probably several competing data sets that suggest different things, and we're making a judgment on it, and then it's for the politicians to make a decision. Comes again back to drawing insight from that data, but still that's very much in the hands of a very small group of scientists and some politicians. So your kind of question is around how do we perhaps democratize or make that data a bit more autonomous for people. I think that's very interesting. Yeah, certainly the debate around theatres and things is because people shouting and singing tends to make the droplets more aerosol, don't they? You know, kind of
so many offices have air conditioning though. Worse, surely, further spread everywhere.
I can't possibly comment, not knowing the true insight of that data. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
So Richard, can I just jump in if that's okay? Sorry, my video was turned off because my Wi-Fi is a bit wobbly, and it seems to work better with my video. So I'm Jen Wells from the University of Brighton, and so I work really closely with Richard, and I'm part of the DRIVA project. I just think it's a really interesting point. I'm wondering if there's a way that you can always look at data in a different way, and obviously you'd expect this coming, so I come from an academic background. So perhaps instead of trying to challenge, as Richard quite rightly says, multiple sources of data from experts all around the world that can't even agree, and then trying to put a layman's interpretation on top of that, which I think is very dangerous territory for multiple reasons. And I'm wondering about looking at historical data and looking at data from multiple sources. Is there a piece to be done about evidence around the impact on people's mental health and well-being that participating in a cultural or creative activity, I would suggest, might be a more powerful narrative that can then be, that certainly can be backed up, if you like, by historical data. Because everyone just assumes data is the sort of stuff that, you know, that happens online, and everything that's new, that's not always the case. And as it goes back to the original point that one of our speakers, I think, had made so eloquently, it's about the question that you want answering. Absolutely. That's all. That was my tuppence worth.
It was a big, bold, valuable tuppence, Jen. Thank you. I'm going to move on to another set of questions shortly, but just to pick up in the chat bar, people are asking around the tools and apps for tracking these kind of measurements. Adam, you've very kindly answered. Do you want to give another, just explain how people can find Vidyard and Worcester and how they work?
Yeah, so we when, say, for example, we have 10 companies that want to use Vidyard or Wistia, basically you can have accounts set them. So you pay per month, and it gets cheaper, obviously, the more you use, more companies you use it with. And it's white labeled, so you can get the data, you can put your name on it, and you can send it off. We're always very open, because when we don't know questions, they can research it. But yeah, predominantly that, and it plugs into HubSpot, so they can see the data gathered. But yeah, they're much of a muchness, Wistia, Vidyard, but yeah, there's lots of companies doing very similar things, and I would imagine that it's the same in the website world and all sorts. I know there's so many other things you can do, and people, you know, Google Analytics and all of those other things, lots of plugins. But if like me, you haven't got time to kind of look into all of that, these things are very packaged and really nice. I'm really open to answer questions. So I could probably be saving money by doing it myself, but I just don't have the capacity. I don't know if that answers your question. Or,
yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to talk to anyone if you want to email me and learn more about those things.
For those catching this later, not live, we'll put links to all those plugins and tools being mentioned, and also obviously to Adam's company in the accompanying blog. Okay, so I just wanted to spend a few minutes looking at the questions from a slightly different angle. Some of these I think we have already started to cover, but just to interrogate a little bit further. around the data itself rather than just the business behaviours. So, I mean, Jen's point there, data is not, we shouldn't just narrow thinking about digital data. There's huge amounts that certainly in this time we should be using and collecting in different ways. I was listening to a podcast yesterday with an interview with Dame Louise Casey, who is, she's had many roles in government trying to solve some big tricky problems. But at the moment she's been put in charge of looking at the homeless, the huge ambitious project to get every rough sleeper housed during the pandemic, which they announced yesterday has been extended with another £100 million worth of resource. She was talking a lot about the huge impact on mental health and on the potential for rough sleepers to then be to have a far more sustainable long-term plan that's far safer and in housing, because of this rather kind of rapid, slightly radical intervention that was made, that the government and local authorities for years have been saying was completely impossible to do. They did it, and now they're able to spend time with those, with the former kind of street sleepers that are now in hotels, and actually collect quite a bit of information about what it is that they will need next in a way that they just couldn't reliably do before. And they're now talking about buying up hotels and buying up and committing money to housing projects that will only be for rehousing people who are currently street sleeping. It's a massive sea change in terms of the impact of looking at that problem through data in a different way. So that's just one example. But also think about what new data do we have? What data do we need for a sustainable recovery? What's out there that maybe we aren't talking about or tapping into? And particularly, again, drawing on Adam's point that this is a new game for quite a lot of people, particularly small businesses. What resources could help businesses or different sectors make more of their data? And I'm sure Jen will gladly talk more about what the University of Brighton are offering through this project. But those are the three questions that I'm going to put back out to you lot. I want to stop talking, and I'd love to hear some thoughts or ideas from any of you. Who's going to tackle one of these first with a thought or an idea?
I'll go. Yeah, so I think to expand what the meaning of data is, the most valuable thing that I think people can do is learn how to interview well. I'm very biased in this regard. I'm a qual researcher. But what I've continually seen over my 20 years is that people don't spend enough time on qual. And then the big data, the measuring things becomes kind of meaningless. It's not that I don't believe in those things, but, I believe in triangulation. So obviously there are some questions which are not qualitative, like, is it safe to open a theatre? Will I cause more infections if I do that? No, obviously that's almost purely a scientific question. But for other questions like, a local restaurant who wants to figure out how the service should change, then the best skill you have is talking to people and doing so neutrally, right? Not doing in a way that, a really good qual researcher would do it. For example, and this is really well understood by very large organizations who focus on producing customer value. Jeff Bezos spends 2 days of his year on the phone to customers. Tim Cook does the same. Being in touch with what people actually want in this time of great change. And I don't mean asking them what they want. That's very different, right? It's understanding their needs, not what they say they want. That's a skill that took me years to really get good at. But I would say that gives you a much better insight into what opportunity actually means than just purely measuring things. Now, caveat, what people say and what they do are very different, and you have to triangulate that. But I would highly encourage people to think more broadly about what data is and not underestimate the painful, difficult, messy process of actually going out and talking to people and then synthesizing what you've heard.
Fantastic, absolutely spot on, and I think mirrors a lot of conversations that I've been a part of around recovery and the way that businesses now need to get rid of any assumptions they've made perhaps about what their customers need, because that's now out of date. And that is something that we will be looking at in a lot more detail next week. We've got Bonami Waddle taking part next week, and she's been spearheading a very big set of different surveys with multiple different angles to exactly find that out across Sussex, and we're going to explore what she's been finding next week. Good, thank you. That's great. Anyone want to pick up on Ben's point? Let's have a debate. Anyone completely disagree? I think what he said was nonsense.
Unfortunately, I absolutely agree. So, but I think you're absolutely right. It's so much about actually how to ask questions, and as you say, it's not actually it's not making any assumptions. And to be frank, I think for quite a long time, there's almost a complacency has set in some areas around, because data, we've got data lakes, right? That's a whole concept that is not a new one. And as you're talking about, just because we have lots of data doesn't mean it's useful. Maybe we didn't ask the right questions in the first place, or you've done analysis that actually doesn't get you to a point where you can action that analysis. So I think there's some complacency around it, but I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of, you really want to understand where you might go. You really have to understand the motivations and the needs. And a lot of that is latent. I mean, as you say, they're not going to articulate specific as what they say, what they do. It's human behavior, right? Is incredibly, it is just so profound that I think it's about asking the right questions in the first place. And obviously that could be done, in multiple ways. And then somewhere between the qual and the quant, actually those two things combined can then tell a meaningful story. And then you can make intelligent decisions. And obviously that's going to change because people's patterns of behavior change. This crisis aside, so that's not something that's static because you've done it and then you think, actually, we're good for a while. They have to be continually responsive, I think, which is a real challenge, particularly for smaller businesses, I would suggest.
Absolutely. One of the most exciting things that I've been seeing at the moment, not just in this strange moment, but I think it's been more acute, is when young people are given the opportunity to try and problem solve using different sorts of technology, because sometimes they're not quite weighed down with some of those assumptions or some of the baggage that's ascribed to what we understand certain things to be. It can be a little bit more optimistic. Loena, I'm going to bring you in here because I know that you've been working on some really exciting projects with young people, using data sets to try and reimagine or to rethink the way that we might do things differently in the future. Do you think that young people have a good grasp of the potential for data?
I think there's a very wide range. So coming from my school's quite small. They're trying to make that shift into encouraging computer science and coding among the girls, but its take-up is slow. However, I've also been to hackathons and events in London where all of the participants there, you'd think they were adults. You'd think they've been working in the field for 20 years. So it's quite a wide range. You get people at both ends, people who know nothing about it, people who know maybe a little bit, they've heard of it, people who've done, and then you go a bit further and you have people who've done projects in it. Then you have people who are absolutely just geniuses at it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's difficult to categorize whether perhaps my generation has a better grasp than perhaps other generations. It really depends on who you ask. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think I have seen a general increase in understanding about what data can be used for, especially in different industries. So I've got friends who are musicians and they're starting to look at how can I pair music with programming, coding. In fact, so I volunteer with a group called the Essex Teammates. We're an online group currently, and it's all about getting girls in the local community and a bit further abroad, because I'm a little far from Essex myself. It's about getting girls to code and share what they found. And so they've been doing projects recently to do with artificial intelligence and music. And so I think the rise of groups like this means that overall understanding about what data can be and what data can do is increasing.
And I, you know, I feel like a very old man now. That's, you know, I am relatively. But I am really optimistic that it is groups like that, that it is those kind of online meetup groups where the critical thinking about data that Ben and Jen very wisely said we need to be thinking about, the interrogation of it, not just taking it at face value, and really thinking about the quality of data. What questions are we asking? Why are we asking those questions? Who's it for? What's behind it? That actually that feels like that kind of thinking is being embedded a little bit more now with children and teenagers when they're starting to look at data sets, way more than it ever was when I was at school. Is that true? Do you think that's there? Do you think that's starting to happen?
I think the accessibility, there's a lot of online learning nowadays. And so I think with the increase of groups online, with all these resources, you get people who are able to learn more. So you're not really reliant on having to go in to school and have a teacher tell you all of these different things. You can be very independent with your learning. So I think that may also encourage a lot of self-studying and greater awareness about data.
And I think, yeah, it comes back to this question of resources. You know, most of us, I think, are scrabbling around trying to make sense of it all. I think it's great that it's now much more embedded within education for people to try and play with data, understand it, ask questions about it. I feel my generation kind of missed out on a lot of that. So we are trying to use tools in different ways. Anybody have any good suggestions? We've heard from Adam there around some tools and plugins. Luana, I expect you've got some interesting apps, or at least kind of websites or places to go to kind of where people could, if you're a beginner, to try and get your head around some of this. Ben, you might have as well. Anybody else? Here's sharing time. Anybody got good tips on resources, places, TED Talks, things like that, that give some good provocative thinking about how we should be challenging what data is, how we use it, particularly for recovery and kind of sustainable renewal?
Should I go? Just perhaps something I've seen recently. It's not huge data sets, but I found it's quite interesting if you Google something you're interested in and put maybe API, or so you can see what kind of data you can get out of it. In particular, I sound very naive saying this, but I never realized that Spotify has an API you can use. So I found it really interesting in the last week, going over sort of looking at data from my account, so looking at what are my top genres. And I think that's been really interesting. So it's quite interesting seeing what data is available online.
Absolutely. Anything else to add from anybody? Jen's had to leave, but I know that certainly the University of Brighton, for anybody who's part of the DRIVA programme, there's a whole wealth of resources, and whilst maybe not quite as much physical access to their very powerful data processing machines as once was, I think we'll be getting back to that at some point soon. There is lots of support and sort of access to their data science teams through this project. So even if you're a complete beginner and thinking about for your business, I need to better understand how to use and break apart and question the kind of data that is available. By being part of this project, you can do that. Vicky's posted the website there. Thank you, Vicky. And it is driverartsdriver.com, which we will remind you of. Okay, so I want to point, before we wrap up, I know it's very warm, I want to point people towards the events next week that I mentioned before. So next week we're going to be looking at lobbying with data. How can data help business influence policy? We've got some brilliant speakers confirmed. We've got Dr. Peter Bleakley, who runs Playful Technology Limited, who's a data scientist and an astrophysicist, but does lots of advising businesses on the way that they can use their data in order to sort of make change happen externally. Bonamy, who I mentioned earlier, who's done this amazing study of how businesses are responding to this particular crisis at the moment in Sussex. It's the biggest kind of survey of its kind in the region. Lots of very interesting insight there about where people are at. But more broadly than that, she does that in lots of different sectors, taking big sets of data and drawing insight from it. So she will be talking about that work. And we have some more to confirm in the next few days. But we'll definitely be looking at the question, how can businesses use their data to affect social, economic, environmental, technological change? How can that data give you influence? So please do come along to that. Same time next week. And you can book your place via the Driver Arts Driver website. And then the week after, same slot on the Thursday afternoon, still confirming a title, but we are going to have an event looking at, talking to a series of artists all around how they have been interpreting transport data and using transport data to create and make a range of different kind of artistic responses and creative responses to that. That's going to be a really exciting session chaired by Donna Close from the University of Brighton. So again, as soon as we've got the details to sign up to that, it'll be via the driverartsdriver.com site. Vicky, are you okay to do the second poll for those that are still online?
Sure thing.
So the question at the beginning, when I was caught in power cut hell, you were being asked to kind of give a sense of where you are at the moment in terms of your understanding how data can be used. Obviously we've just scratched the tip of the iceberg. You've heard some really interesting examples from 3 projects and then put that into a slightly wider context. You will get, we'll do some further reading and signposting for you on the blog that will accompany this when the recording's published. But it'd be great to know, just for our reference, whether you feel slightly more confident in some of your own explorations. Okay, so while you're doing that, here's final chance for anyone who wants to make a comment or a question or signpost or mention somebody or somewhere to go that might take this debate further. Otherwise, I want to say a huge thank you to Llewellyn, to Ben, to Adam for their time and energy. Oh, good. So it's shifted a little bit. People found some inspiration. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for our 3 speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for coming along and those that are catching this later on the on YouTube. And we hope to see you next week for the session on lobbying. Go visit driverartsdriver.com where you will find everything that you need. So go off and cool down, have a dip in the sea and a long lemonade, and see you all very soon.